A prime minister stands in front of Alberta oil workers and says the one thing almost nobody in his position was expected to say. He will not cut off the oil. He will not turn off the pipelines. He will not use Canada's single most powerful economic weapon against the United States, even as Washington prepares to slap 50% tariffs on billions of dollars of Canadian goods in a matter of days. On the surface, that sounds like surrender. It sounds like a leader walking into a trade war and leaving his best weapon locked in the case. But look closer at what has actually been happening in Ottawa, in Calgary, and on the docks of British Columbia over the past year, and a very different picture starts to emerge. While Mark Carney has been publicly refusing to weaponize Canadian oil, his government has quietly been executing a strategy that does something more permanent and arguably more dangerous to American leverage than any short-term export ban ever could. He is making the United States less necessary. And that distinction between refusing to pull a trigger and rendering the gun itself obsolete is the real story behind the headlines everyone else is reporting on wrong. Here is what most people watching this trade fight are missing. The obvious narrative is a familiar one. Trump threatens tariffs, Carney negotiates, both sides posture, a deadline arrives, something gets patched together at the last minute. That has been the rhythm of this relationship for months. But underneath that rhythm, there's a structural shift taking place in how Canadian oil actually moves around the world. One that has almost nothing to do with the current round of tariff threats and everything to do with a decision made years ago that is only now starting to pay off. To understand why Carney can afford to sound so calm while Trump keeps escalating, you need to understand exactly how much economic weight Canadian oil actually carries, why that weight has traditionally been leverage Canada was too afraid to use, and why that fear is now eroding faster than most people in Washington seem to have noticed. Start with the raw numbers, because they explain everything about why this fight even exists. Canadian crude oil, drawn overwhelmingly from the oil sands of northern Alberta, accounts for close to 60% of all crude oil imported into the United States, according to figures from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, cited widely in recent coverage of the trade dispute. That is not a niche supplier relationship. That is a dependency so deep that American refineries across the Midwest and the Gulf Coast have spent decades physically configuring their equipment specifically to process the heavy, sour crude that comes out of the Alberta oil sands, a type of crude that is meaningfully different from the lighter oil produced domestically in places like Texas. You cannot simply swap that supply chain out overnight. Replacing 60% of your crude import stream is not a policy decision you make in a press conference. It would take years, enormous capital investment, and refinery retooling on a scale that has never been seriously attempted. That is the leverage everyone keeps talking about. And on paper, it should make Canada nearly untouchable in any economic standoff with Washington. And yet, for months, Prime Minister Mark Carney has done something that infuriated some of his own political allies. He has refused to use it. When Trump signed an order imposing an additional 50% tariff on a range of Canadian products, including wine, hockey sticks, cement, and dozens of other categories, set to take effect on August 19, 2026. The obvious political move for Carney would have been to reach for the same lever every columnist and opposition figure was demanding he pull. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, one of the loudest voices among Canada's provincial leaders, publicly called for exactly that, urging the federal government to withhold Canadian oil and potash to, in his words, dismantle the United States economically. At a meeting of Canada's 13 premiers in Charlottetown in July 2026, the pressure on Carney to commit to energy retaliation was intense enough that it became, according to reporting from CBC News, a genuine pressure point among Canada's political leadership. Carney did not take the bait, and understanding why requires appreciating just how differently he approaches confrontation compared to the political tradition he emerged from. Before entering politics, Carney spent his career running two G7 central banks, first the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, and later the Bank of England through the turbulence of Brexit, a background that shaped a governing style built around measured statements, careful signaling, and an evident discomfort with the kind of theatrical brinkmanship that defines so much of Trump's own approach to negotiation. Where Trump treats tariff threats as opening bids in a public negotiation conducted partly through cable news and social media, Carney has generally tried to keep the substantive bargaining behind closed doors, reserving his public remarks for careful, deliberately unspecific language about keeping all options open rather than committing to any particular countermeasure in advance. That temperamental gap between the two leaders has itself become a recurring subplot in how this standoff is played out, with Canadian commentators frequently noting that Carney seems to view public escalation as a tool to be used sparingly, if at all, compared to a president for whom public escalation is very often the primary instrument of negotiation. Speaking to reporters during a trip to Alberta, he was asked directly whether he would use Canadian oil as a pressure tactic in the negotiations. His answer, when you actually read it closely, is worth paying attention to. because it reveals more strategic thinking than a simple refusal would suggest. He said he did not see the value in that approach. He talked about trust as a commodity in its own right, arguing that one of Canada's most valuable assets in the relationship is its reputation as a supplier that never wavers, regardless of political pressure. When you are the supplier of something as critical as energy, he said, you have to think very hard about the consequences of not supplying it. It is a strikingly different kind of leverage argument than the one Doug Ford was making. Ford's version treats oil as a weapon to be fired. Carney's version treats reliability itself as the actual asset, one that a single dramatic gesture could permanently damage even if it inflicted short-term pain on the United States. This is where the story most casual observers are missing begins to take shape. Carney's refusal to use oil as a weapon is not really about being conciliatory toward Trump. It is about protecting something that Canada has spent the better part of a decade trying to build, and that would be instantly destroyed the moment Ottawa proved itself willing to interrupt supply for political leverage. That asset is Canada's credibility as the most reliable, most geographically secure, most politically stable major oil exporter on Earth. At a moment when global energy buyers are increasingly nervous about supply security from almost everywhere else. If Canada cuts off the tap once, even briefly, even successfully, it confirms to every buyer everywhere, including the very Asian markets Canada has spent years courting, that Canadian oil comes with political strings attached. That single miscalculation could cost Canada far more in lost long-term contracts and depressed pricing than any short-term tariff damage it might inflict on the United States. Carney appears to understand that trade-off in a way his provincial critics either do not share or are willing to risk. But here's the detail that changes the entire picture. The one that explains why the framing of Carney draining Trump's leverage is not actually wrong, even though it looks, on the surface, like Carney is doing nothing at all. While he has been publicly ruling out an oil embargo, his government has been simultaneously executing the single most consequential change to Canada's energy export infrastructure in a generation, and that change is doing far more long-term damage to American leverage than a short-term export cutoff ever could. It is the quiet completion, and now the expansion, of Canada's pipeline access to the Pacific coast. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to a decision made under Carney's predecessor, Justin Trudeau, in 2018, when the federal government spent roughly $5.5 billion Canadian dollars, adjusted for inflation, to buy the Trans Mountain pipeline system outright from Kinder Morgan, after the American company threatened to abandon the expansion project, amid regulatory delays and Indigenous opposition. That decision was controversial at the time, criticized from both the political left and right, and the project's final cost ballooned to roughly 34 billion Canadian dollars by the time construction was finally completed in May 2024, 7 years behind the original schedule. But the underlying strategic logic never changed. For decades, more than 90% of Canadian oil exports flowed through pipelines that terminate in the United States, meaning American refiners were not just Canada's biggest customer. They were functionally its only customer with meaningful pipeline access. As recently as a few years before the expansion opened, non-US oil exports made up barely 3% of Canada's total crude exports. Canada produced one of the largest oil reserves on the planet and had almost no way to sell any of it to anyone except its neighbor to the south. That captive relationship is exactly what gave the United States its own quiet form of leverage over Canada for decades, leverage that rarely gets discussed in the current tariff conversation, but that matters enormously to understanding why this moment is different. If your only customer for your most valuable export is a single country, that country does not need to threaten you directly. The dependency itself does the work. American refiners could and did negotiate steep discounts on Canadian crude precisely because Canadian producers had nowhere else to sell it. That price gap, known in the industry as the Western Canadian Select Discount, cost Canadian producers and, by extension, Canadian government revenues, billions of dollars a year for most of the past 2 decades. The completed Trans Mountain expansion started closing that gap almost immediately, and the scale of the shift has surprised even some of the analysts who championed the project. According to data compiled by the Montreal Economic Institute, the price discount on Canadian crude fell by more than 37% in the 18 months following the pipeline expansion compared to the 18 months before it, a change estimated to be worth more than 16.7 billion US dollars in additional revenue for Canadian producers, and ultimately Canadian government coffers. Oil exports outside the United States, essentially non-existent before the expansion, grew from around 3% of total Canadian crude exports to roughly 14% within about a year and a half of the pipeline opening. Looking specifically at the Westridge Marine Terminal in British Columbia, the actual export point for the pipeline, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of all crude that now moves through it, heads to Asia rather than the United States, according to reporting from Al Jazeera. By October 2025, according to ATB economics figures reported by Oil Price, Calm, the value of Alberta's oil exports to Asia had gone from literally zero before the pipeline expansion to more than 800 million US dollars, or roughly 1.1 billion Canadian dollars. Those numbers, while still a small fraction of Canada's overall oil trade, represent something the raw percentages do not fully capture: proof of concept. For the first time in the modern history of Canada's oil industry, there's a functioning, operating, revenue-generating alternative to selling everything to the United States. And Carney's government has moved aggressively to build on that proof of concept rather than treat it as a one-off achievement. In July 2026, Carney secured an investment agreement with the government of British Columbia, overcoming years of provincial resistance to move forward with a brand new pipeline connecting Alberta's oil sands directly to Canada's Pacific coast, running along a similar corridor to the existing Trans Mountain system, but adding entirely new capacity rather than simply expanding what already exists. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, once a fierce critic of federal energy policy, is now publicly aligned with Ottawa on the project, a political alignment that would have seemed almost impossible just a few years earlier given the long-running antagonism between the federal government and Canada's oil-producing heartland over pipeline access. The reasoning behind the new pipeline is explicit, and it is not subtle. According to Al Jazeera's coverage of the announcement, Ottawa has framed the project directly around reducing Canada's economic dependence on the United States, specifically citing the ongoing trade war as the catalyst. Analysis published by The Hub estimates that if the new pipeline matches the export patterns already established by the existing Trans Mountain system, the dollar value of Canada's non-U.S. crude oil exports could rise from roughly $20 billion to $50 billion, pushing the share of Canadian crude exports going to markets outside the United States from around 15% up to 23%. That is not a cosmetic change. That is a structural rebalancing of one of the most important trade relationships in the world, engineered deliberately, and timed to arrive precisely while Washington is trying to extract maximum concessions from Ottawa using tariff threats. This is the real answer to why Carney can afford to sound so unbothered in press conferences while Trump escalates the rhetoric. He is not refusing to use leverage because Canada lacks any. He is refusing to use the blunt, reversible, reputation-destroying version of leverage, an export ban that could be undone the moment negotiations improve, but that would leave lasting scars on Canada's credibility as a supplier, in favor of building a version of leverage that cannot be unbuilt once it exists. A pipeline to the Pacific is not a threat. It is a fact on the ground. Once it is operating, the United States permanently loses a portion of the near total control it has held over Canadian oil pricing and volume for the better part of a century, whether or not Trump ever imposes another tariff again. That is what draining leverage actually looks like, when a country plays a long, patient game instead of reaching for a dramatic, short-term gesture that plays well in a press conference, but weakens your position for the next decade. None of this means the current tariff standoff is a minor sideshow, and it would be dishonest to suggest Carney's government is treating it that way. The stakes on the table right now are genuinely significant. The 50% tariffs, set to take effect on August 19th, unless a deal is reached beforehand, would apply even to goods that would otherwise qualify for exemption under the existing Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, and according to figures compiled by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, they span an extraordinary range of industries: dairy products, alcohol, electronics and telecom equipment, furniture, building materials like lumber and cement, plastics and packaging, clothing and footwear, toys, agricultural goods, and dozens of other categories. Notably, and this detail matters enormously to the oil leverage question, Washington explicitly excluded energy products, fishery products, and critical minerals from the tariff list, which tells you something important about how even the Trump administration understands the underlying dependency it is operating within. The White House can afford to punish Canadian wine and hockey sticks. It cannot afford, and appears to know it cannot afford, to touch the oil. The negotiations themselves have been intense and, by the accounts of multiple reporters covering them closely, genuinely uncertain in their outcome as the deadline approaches. Canada's minister responsible for U.S. trade relations, Dominic LeBlanc, has met with U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer 3 times in as many weeks heading into the deadline, according to reporting from Reuters and Inside U.S. Trade, with both sides working to assemble a framework that could be presented to Trump before August 19th. The issues on the table go well beyond oil. Washington has pointed to Canada's 25% tariff on American-made vehicles, the near total halt on American alcohol sales imposed by Canadian provinces in an earlier round of retaliation, and preferential dairy market access that Canada has extended to the European Union but not to the United States, as the core grievances driving the new tariff threat. Canada, for its part, has reportedly signaled willingness to address the alcohol and auto tariff issues and has acknowledged it may simply have to accept certain steel and aluminum tariffs rather than fight every front simultaneously, while pushing hard for relief on the Section 232 tariffs that have hit its automotive sector particularly hard. As of just days before the deadline, according to CBC News reporting from earlier this week, Canada rejected the latest American counteroffer, with officials describing themselves as unsatisfied with the terms on the table. Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, reportedly warned her American counterparts directly that if the new tariffs take effect on August 19th without a resolution, it would represent what one report described as a cliff, a moment that risks halting the negotiating process altogether rather than simply raising the temperature. At the same time, a Canadian government source told Reuters just 2 days ago that talks were progressing reasonably well, and crucially, that Washington also appeared genuinely motivated to reach an agreement before the deadline, suggesting the pressure to avoid a full rupture is not purely one-sided. Former Canadian ambassador to the United States, David McNaughton, offered a more skeptical read, telling BNN Bloomberg that while Canada has assembled a substantial package of proposals, he was not convinced Trump himself was ready to sign off on the kind of comprehensive deal Ottawa is seeking, warning against Canada making piecemeal concessions that could be pocketed without securing a full resolution in return. This is the point in the story where the deeper strategic picture starts to matter more than the day-to-day headlines about who met with whom in Washington this week. Whatever happens on August 19th, whether a deal is struck at the last minute, whether tariffs take effect and get negotiated down later, or whether this becomes another prolonged standoff like the one that followed an earlier August 1st deadline that came and went, with a new 35% tariff on non-USMCA covered goods, the structural trend underneath the negotiation does not reset. Every barrel of Canadian crude that finds a buyer in Asia instead of the United States is a barrel that permanently reduces how much coercive power Washington holds over Ottawa in every future negotiation, tariff-related or otherwise. And that trend is accelerating, not slowing down, even as the tariff fight intensifies. There's also a domestic political dimension to Carney's restraint that deserves attention because it explains why his approach, cautious as it looks from the outside, has not collapsed under pressure from more aggressive voices within his own country. A report from the Business Council of Canada's affiliated research, cited in recent coverage, estimated that a full breakdown of the Canada-US trade relationship could put roughly 102,000 Canadian jobs at risk, a number that has weighed heavily on provincial leaders trying to balance defiance with economic pragmatism. Goldie Hyder, the head of the Business Council of Canada, has been publicly pushing Carney to reach a deal rather than escalate. A reminder that Canada's business establishment, unlike some of its more combative premiers, generally favors stability over a dramatic confrontation, however satisfying that confrontation might feel politically. Balancing those competing pressures, provinces like Ontario pushing for toughness, Quebec's premier defending dairy and aluminum interests, business leaders warning about job losses, and a federal government trying to hold a genuinely difficult negotiating line is precisely why Carney has repeatedly described his position using careful, non-committal language, saying at various points that everything is on the table, while also declining to specify exactly what that means in practice. It's worth being honest here about the limits of the diversification story, too, because the picture is not simply one of Canada effortlessly escaping American dependence. Even with the Trans Mountain expansion fully operational and a new pipeline now formally announced, the overwhelming majority of Canadian crude, somewhere around 85% by recent estimates, still flows to the United States. China, despite years of speculation about a deeper Canada-China energy relationship, imports only about 1% of its total crude from Canada. A reminder that building new pipeline capacity does not automatically create new demand relationships. Those have to be negotiated and developed over years, not overnight. American refineries remain deeply structurally configured for the specific type of heavy crude that Alberta produces, which means even a successful diversification push will not eliminate the underlying economic logic that makes the U.S. market attractive to Canadian producers in the first place. And building the new Pacific pipeline itself is not guaranteed to be simple or cheap. Earlier cost estimates for a comparable project have run as high as 50 billion Canadian dollars, and as of earlier this year, no private sector investor had yet stepped forward to fully fund a proposal of that scale, meaning federal and provincial government backing may again prove essential, just as it did with the original Trans Mountain purchase. There's also an international dimension to this story that rarely makes it into the daily coverage of the tariff deadline, but that matters enormously to how seriously other countries are watching what Canada is doing right now. Energy security has become one of the defining strategic anxieties of the past several years for countries across Asia and Europe, driven by the disruption to global energy markets following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the resulting scramble by importing nations to reduce reliance on suppliers seen as politically unstable or geopolitically risky. Against that backdrop, a country like Canada, a G7 democracy with enormous proven reserves, a stable legal system, and crucially, A demonstrated willingness in this current standoff not to weaponize its energy exports, even under significant domestic political pressure to do so, becomes an unusually attractive long-term partner for energy importing nations trying to diversify away from more volatile suppliers in the Middle East, Russia, or Venezuela. Carney's refusal to turn off the taps toward the United States is not just a message aimed at Washington. It is simultaneously a message aimed at Tokyo, Seoul, and other Asian capitals that Canada is precisely the kind of supplier that does not let its energy exports become a bargaining chip, a signal that only strengthens the case for exactly the kind of long-term supply contracts Canada needs to make its Pacific pipeline investment pay off. That dynamic creates an interesting asymmetry worth spelling out clearly. If Carney had done what Doug Ford and other critics wanted and moved to restrict oil exports to the United States as retaliation for the tariffs, it would have delivered a jolt of short-term pain to American markets and refiners, no question. But it would have simultaneously undermined the exact reputation Canada is relying on to convince skeptical Asian buyers that a long-term contract with a Canadian supplier is safer than one with a supplier in a less stable part of the world. In trying to win the tariff fight of the moment, Canada would have risked losing the much larger prize of becoming a genuinely diversified, globally significant energy exporter for the next several decades. Carney's team appears to have run that calculation and concluded the short-term satisfaction was not worth the long-term cost, a conclusion that, whether or not it proves politically popular at home in the middle of a tense negotiation, reflects a fairly disciplined piece of strategic thinking. None of this is to say Ottawa has been completely passive in the broader trade fight. Canada has, at various points over the past year, imposed its own retaliatory tariffs on American goods, targeted specifically at industries, and in some reporting, congressional districts calculated to maximize political pressure on Washington without triggering the kind of full economic rupture that would harm Canadian consumers and businesses more than it hurt the intended American target. Provincial governments, led initially by Ontario, pulled American alcohol brands off government-run liquor store shelves in an earlier round of retaliation. A symbolic but economically meaningful move given how much U.S. alcohol exports rely on the Canadian market. Removing those provincial alcohol restrictions is now one of the specific concessions on the table in the current negotiations, illustrating how the last round of Canadian retaliation has become a bargaining chip in this round of talks. A reminder that trade wars of this kind tend to build up layers of mutual grievance that make every subsequent negotiation more complicated than the one before it, with each side's earlier retaliatory move becoming a fresh obstacle that has to be dismantled before the next round of talks can even begin, let alone conclude with an actual resolution. So what does all of this actually add up to, heading into the final days before the August 19th deadline? The honest strategic assessment is this. Mark Carney has made a calculated bet that the version of leverage worth protecting is not the dramatic headline-grabbing kind, an oil embargo that would dominate news cycles for a week and then be undone the moment negotiations improved, but the slow, structural kind that permanently changes the shape of the relationship regardless of who occupies the White House, or how any single round of tariff negotiations turns out. By refusing to weaponize Canadian energy in the short term, he protects the reputation for reliability that makes Canadian oil valuable to buyers far beyond the United States. By simultaneously pushing pipeline infrastructure to the Pacific coast at a pace that would have seemed politically impossible just a few years ago, he ensures that every year that passes, the United States has a slightly smaller hold over Canada's most important export, whether or not Washington ever notices the shift happening in real time. It also helps to put this moment in the context of how often this exact cycle has repeated itself since Trump returned to office. This is not the first tariff deadline Canada has faced, and it will likely not be the last. Earlier this year, an August 1st deadline for a broader trade agreement came and went without resolution, triggering a 35% tariff on Canadian exports not covered by the existing USMCA framework. Before that, Carney's government had already gone through a cycle of imposing retaliatory tariffs on American goods in response to earlier Trump measures, only to remove some of those retaliatory tariffs in August 2025 on U.S. products that complied with the trade agreement, a gesture intended to de-escalate and signal good faith. That back and forth, tariffs imposed, retaliation threatened, partial de-escalation, followed by an entirely new round of tariff threats months later, has become the defining rhythm of the relationship under the current American administration. Trump has, at various points over the past year, also floated additional tariffs specifically targeting Canadian fertilizer exports. Another reminder that the pressure campaign has never been confined to a single sector, and has instead moved fluidly across whichever Canadian industry seemed most politically useful to target at a given moment. Understanding that pattern helps explain why Carney's energy strategy looks the way it does. A government that reacted to every individual tariff threat with an equally dramatic countermeasure would likely have escalated this relationship into full economic rupture months ago, given how many separate flashpoints have already emerged: vehicles, dairy, alcohol, fertilizer, lumber, and now a sweeping 50% tariff covering more than a dozen industries simultaneously. Instead, Carney's approach has been to absorb most of these individual shocks through negotiation and targeted retaliation, reserving the country's single largest source of genuine structural leverage, energy, for a strategy that operates on a completely different timeline than the news cycle. Tariff deadlines come and go every few months. Pipelines, once built, operate for decades. Carney appears to be betting that the side playing the longer game ultimately gains more ground, even if it means enduring short-term pain and, at times, public criticism for not appearing tough enough in the moment. That approach also lines up with a broader lesson. The current trade war has taught Canadian policymakers about the risks of concentrated dependency in general, a lesson that extends well beyond oil. Canada's natural gas sector followed a strikingly similar path to its oil sector for decades, almost entirely captive to the American market through cross-border pipeline infrastructure, until the country's first liquefied natural gas export terminal began operating on the west coast at Kitimat in mid-2025. Before that facility opened, every cubic meter of Canadian natural gas exported anywhere in the world went to the United States by default, simply because there was no alternative infrastructure to send it anywhere else. The Kitimat terminal, like the Trans Mountain pipeline before it, represents the same underlying strategic insight applied to a different resource. Physical infrastructure, not political rhetoric, is what actually determines how much leverage one country holds over another in a trade relationship built on resource dependency. Politicians can threaten tariffs and counter-tariffs indefinitely, but those threats only work as leverage for as long as the underlying physical supply chain gives one side no alternative but to keep trading with the other. Looked at from that angle, the entire tariff confrontation playing out this month, as dramatic and consequential as it is for the specific industries caught in the crossfire, may ultimately be remembered less for whatever agreement or breakdown happens around August 19th. And more as the moment historians point to when Canada's decades-long era of captive energy dependency on the United States was already ending, just not loudly enough for most people to have noticed it happening in real time. Every ship that leaves the Westridge terminal loaded with Alberta crude bound for a refinery in South Korea or Japan is a small, almost invisible data point. But data points accumulate, and the trajectory they describe, a widening supplier base, a shrinking share of exports flowing to a single customer, a growing willingness among Asian buyers to sign long-term contracts with a country they increasingly view as a stable alternative to more volatile producers elsewhere in the world, all point in one direction. The tariffs may dominate this week's headlines. The pipelines are what will still be moving oil in 20 years, long after this particular round of negotiations is a footnote in the history of the relationship. What Trump's tariff threats have not managed to do, despite months of pressure and a genuinely painful set of levies set to take effect on Canadian goods across a dozen industries, is force Canada to abandon that long game in favor of a short-term reaction. Whether that restraint proves to be strategic wisdom or a missed opportunity may depend on how the next few days of negotiations play out, and whether the August 19th deadline produces a genuine deal or another prolonged standoff. Even the most optimistic outcome, a comprehensive agreement that removes the 50% tariff threat entirely, would not undo the pipeline investments already made or the Asian supply contracts already being negotiated, because those decisions were never really about winning this particular round of talks in the first place. They were about ensuring that whichever administration occupies the White House 5, 10, or 20 years from now inherits a Canada that has more options than the one Trump is negotiating with today. And that, more than any single tariff deadline, is probably the detail future analysts of this trade relationship will end up treating as the real turning point, buried as it was beneath weeks of headlines about deadlines, retaliation, and diplomatic brinkmanship that most people were far too focused on to notice happening at all. But the underlying trend, pipelines moving west, Asian buyers slowly becoming real customers instead of theoretical ones, and a Canadian government treating trust as a strategic asset rather than a weakness, is not going to reverse itself regardless of what happens at the negotiating table this month. Trump built his trade strategy around the assumption that Canadian dependence on the American market was permanent and unshakable. Carney's quiet answer, delivered not through a dramatic threat, but through years of infrastructure decisions most people were not paying attention to, is that permanence was never guaranteed in the first place. And the clock on America's oil leverage over its northern neighbor has been running out far longer than this particular tariff fight has even existed.